Right. Good afternoon and welcome back. Hope that you have had a good weekend. I know that the weather has been very, very cold and we've had single-digit temperatures for a while. I was up at the pass yesterday and know how challenging that can be. As a reminder, if you find yourself unable to safely come to class due to the weather, please let me know and I'm happy to send you a Zoom link for that day to help you to participate remotely. I want you to be safe, and I know especially if this is your first year or two here, that navigating some of this weather can be a little bit challenging. So stay safe out there. So I'd also imagine that a few of you are a little bit tired, judging by the submissions for the small group reflection. I know some of you were burning the midnight oil. I'm not judging. I was there too. It's a wonder that my heart is still doing okay with all the very, very late nights with energy drinks that I had completing essays as a student. So I get it. So thank you for getting those in. I look forward to reading your small group reflections. I should have grades back to you on those by the end of the week, and I'll take some time to, after that, debrief and discuss some of the general things that I noticed with that assignment. So we took time last class to talk about the small group reflection, some things to help you to prepare. We also took some time to talk about group norms and some of the ways that we're able to listen in groups effectively. Last Friday, I had us do a small group activity where we have a new employee at Dutch Bros, and you're asked to think about how you can help that person become acclimated and included to the group. So again, another example of a group activity that helps us to think about group participation and norms. We talked last class about how norms are defined in a lot of different ways, how formal a particular norm might be. Is it written? Is it coded? Is it a norm that is a big deal if it's violated, right? If you're speaking out of turn or saying what you shouldn't say or do, right? And what is the importance of that particular norm for the group as well? So how might we see that norm as important, significant, or meaningful to the group? Regeneration of organs of belief is a tendency that we forgive some of the issues of the past, right? And focus instead on working constructively in the future, knowing that oftentimes we're forced to continue working with people in a group who we might not always want to work with. So today, I do want to take some time to get us thinking about the next written assignment in the course. So that's going to be due 3 weeks out from now on February 19th. So I want to make sure that you have plenty of time to prepare, think about, and start to develop this writing assignment. We'll also spend this week diving into culture, our understanding of culture, how culture impacts our communication, and how we can use skills of culture to better engage in small group settings. So as mentioned, small group reflection, grades should be up by the end of the week on that assignment. So the next assignment for the course is the small group assessment. And I've gone ahead and posted the prompt as well as the rubric for that assignment on Canvas. So it should show up on the sidebar on things being upcoming, being due, but it also shows up here under week number 6. So for the small group assessment, the first few weeks of the quarter, you've had the opportunity to participate in several different group activities in the class, right? These have been ones including the icebreaker at the very beginning of class, where I was asking you to find things in common with somebody else. The survival activity, you're trapped in the Canadian wilderness. You have to rank items that you need in order to get out of there. We did an activity where I was asking you to explain some of the different theoretical approaches to small group communication. We did a group activity of creating a listable space for an interview. We did the activity on Friday, which I asked you to think about how to acclimate a new member of a group. We'll be doing some more small group activities in class. So if you've not been able to attend some of these group activities, that's okay. We'll have more for you to work from here. And what I'm asking you to do is to think about some of these prompts. And in about 2 pages, double space, standard font margins, I'll be asking you to take some time to describe, first of all, how you employed elements of group problem solving to address these problems in class, the different steps of problem solving that are involved in group decision making to help substantiate your answer. We'll be dedicating significant time next week to discussing how groups engage in problem solving and some of the techniques for doing so effectively. Secondarily, I'll be asking you to think about the role of listening in group communication, to think about in what ways you practiced good listening as a member of the group, drawing from things that we've talked about last week. And then lastly, we'll be discussing culture and diversity in group communication a lot this week, including in this week's readings. I want you to be thinking about how your own cultural identity and background is shaping the way that you're participating in these group activities. It impacts your engagement with other group members. Just like last time, I will look at rough drafts, outlines, or any feedback that you would like in advance. Since it's due on the 19th, if you send it to me by the Friday before, I will be willing to turn around some feedback and responses to you. Like last time, this has a rubric that just goes over the ways that I'll be grading the assignment. I'm looking for you including good examples, good substantiation, both from examples of your participation in class, as well as examples from the text that highlight some of these concepts and ideas like problem solving and culture. At least 2 pages. Again, it can be over, that's okay, but good structure. And then good use of style, again, including works cited and in-text citations in order to substantiate and support your main points. That's out of 200 or 20%. So again, that'll be available for you there to work on. And I encourage you to start to think about how you might incorporate examples of some of the work that you've done in class here. So before I get into any of the new stuff for today, does anybody have any questions? Anything we talked about last class or anything related to the small group assessment? Great. Questions do come up at any point, please let me know and I'm happy to help. And then lastly, as a reminder, the week number 3 quiz was due yesterday, and then I have the week number 4 quiz that will be due this Sunday, so I'm going to work through those. How many folks have taken a class before here, EOU or somewhere else, where there was a unit or a focus in that class on culture? Okay, so a few of you, including a couple who might have seen that in class with me, like interpersonal communication. So if you have not taken a class that gets into culture or the role of culture, there's a good chance that you will very soon in the future, right? Culture is something that's pretty deeply connected to a lot of different fields, right? It connects to communication studies, it connects to English and writing, it connects to anthropology, sociology, it connects to history, it connects to art, it connects to theater, right? Culture is pretty ubiquitous and even connects into some things such as the hard sciences in ways that you might not necessarily expect, such as cultural and social elements related to health and medicine and so forth, right? So there's a good chance that you've either already seen culture discussed in another context, or you might soon see culture discussed in another course. But I think either way, it's useful for us to put it in this class and talk about it this week because, right, as we've talked about, one of the most important skills that employers are looking for are our ability to work effectively in groups, to work in teams, and that's something we have to do whether we like to or not. And when we're working in groups, we're not working with clones of ourselves. We're working with people who are coming from very different cultures, different backgrounds, environments, perspectives, and lived experiences as we do. And employers, team members want people who are able to communicate effectively with people that are very different than us, right? So not only developing a skill set with communicating with people that come from very different experiences than we do, but also the idea that a small group is able to develop its own culture and set of experiences as a group is an important thing that we'll be exploring and looking at in more detail. So culture, to kind of break it down, right? There are a lot of definitions and perspectives about culture, but I think for the purposes of this class, we can pare it down to describe it in a few different ways. First of all, culture comprises beliefs, right? Beliefs are things that are sincerely held, that are important, that are practiced, and significant to members of that group, right? So beliefs might include things such as religious beliefs, spiritual beliefs, beliefs about collective action, and how people in a group should behave, right? One good example of how we can practice good, culturally competent and sensitive communication in group settings is to think about how things such as religious or spiritual holidays might or might not be represented as like national holidays, days off, right? So for instance, we recognize that there are people who might have a religious holiday or issue that's causing them to need to miss a particular class. So that's an important element for us to think about here. Culture also involves attitudes, right? Our cognitive predisposition or approach or way that we think about or address an issue. For example, a lot of Buddhist or Hindu thought, right, tends to be more focused on taking things as they come, right, being open to embracing a more passive approach to dealing with conflict and issues as they emerge, right? So how we choose to address issues as they happen, including in a group setting, is important. Values, right, refer to things that members of a group see as important or significant. So one good example here of values and how values can clash is if we think about following 9/11, the passage of the Patriot Act, right? Patriot Act was designed to increase things such as surveillance of phones, of emails, of other personal information, right? And on one end, there's a value that is valuing security, right, including national security, that the ability to receive this information or wiretap can be used to identify and stop potential threats. And on the other end, there are folks who argue more on the value of freedom and argue that this type of surveillance risks threatening the freedom or security of individuals. So different debates, right? Regardless of where you might fall on that, it's an example here of how values could differ, how somebody would choose to address or approach a particular issue. And then traditions refer to things that are passed down and practiced among members of a group, right? So perhaps you're a member of a group in which there is, a chant or pump up speech or warm up that you always do as a member of that group. Again, I was in speech and debate. We like to stand in a circle and do vocal warm ups where we do tongue twisters together, and that'd be our tradition. Other groups, you might celebrate a holiday. You might choose to celebrate that holiday, such as Hanukkah, right, by visiting that family and having a very traditional practice at that event, right? Or perhaps you have a regular family chat or call with members of your extended family. So the traditions, the things that you do and continue to do as a member of that culture are important. And they involve the psychological aspects of our expectations in communication. In other words, right, communication is how we use symbols to convey meaning. And in this way, right, it's not just what we say in terms of language, in terms of our accent, in terms of the language that we're speaking, in terms of the words that we use, but it's also about how people are understanding and making sense of how we're speaking too, right? Culture is shaping and filtering out how we come to understand our communication with each other. So in other words, right, if we're a member of a more collectivist culture, as we've talked about, more collectivist cultures tend to focus on the needs of the group over the needs of an individual. Perhaps we find ourselves frustrated if we're in a meeting and it feels like people in that meeting are vying for attention, are vying for credit, are vying for power with each other over collaboration, right? So we might find that our psychological approach to that meeting is to be frustrated and angry based on our own experience, or vice versa. We're a more individualistic culture. There's a much more collectivist culture in that meeting. We find ourselves pushing back against that. Pictured here are indigenous groups in the Eastern Oregon and Washington area, including the Umatilla, Cayuse, and Walla Walla, confederated tribes and the kind of geographic areas that some of these groups occupy, showing the significance of physicality, place and space, and thinking about culture too, right? The use of things such as rivers, of mountains, of land, and the significance that we attach to that is oftentimes a pretty defining element of cultures in a geographic context too. So when it comes to communication, there's a couple ways that we can think about this here, right? One of them is the notion of intracultural communication, right? So to give you an example, we can think about American Sign Language. In ASL, right, Intracultural communication would be two people signing and speaking together using ASL toward one another. So intercultural communication, by contrast, refers to communicating among those who are unalike culturally, who have different cultural experiences from each other, and might be in a designated space or situation in which those cultural differences are highlighted, right? Oftentimes we find ourselves members of multiple cultures and lived experiences, but it's this idea that there is differences that are being highlighted in how we're communicating with those individuals. Despite a lot of families in which there might be a child or a parent who is deaf and a kid or a parent who's not deaf, right? You have a mix there. Intracultural communication is less common. There are fewer parents who will learn ASL to sign to their deaf child. And it's more common for there to be intercultural communication, in which the majority of parents use things such as lip reading, right, or writing to communicate. So unfortunately, there's less bridging that divide across those differences statistically, but it's an example of some of the ways that intercultural communication might pose some unique challenges, right? A lot of European countries such as Germany and France, take a really big emphasis on teaching students in K-12 to be bilingual, including with English. So oftentimes you visit those countries and you have a lot of people there who have at least some grasp of English when you're speaking to them, even if it's not the native language. Again, an example of engaging in intercultural communication. One thing that we tend to notice, right, is the role of things such as nonverbal communication and the significance of that in communicating across cultures too. In fact, practice like watching a film in another language for like a couple minutes, and there's a good chance you can at least parse out some of the things that are happening on the basis of the nonverbal communication that they use with each other. So a key goal of intercultural communication is to avoid an idea known as ethnocentrism. So as a member of a culture, perhaps it's our locality or region, perhaps it's related to race, perhaps it's related to clubs or activities that we're a part of, right? They're familiar to us. We have a frame of reference with them, right? And there's a level of comfort in it making sense to us that might come from growing up in that context. And that's great, right? I think it's great for us to celebrate and acknowledge our own culture and lived experience that shapes who we are. But one of the challenges of communicating and engaging effectively in small groups is to avoid the belief that our own culture and a set of experiences is inherently better than the set of experiences of members of a different culture, right? If we impose that belief onto other cultures and groups, we have greater difficulty understanding the needs and concerns of other cultures. We also have greater difficulty understanding why a particular culture might adopt a different set of beliefs or views, right? A lot of countries that tend to be more collectivist in origin, such as China and Japan, are countries that have significantly higher population density, right? In which there's a greater need for members of that culture to communicate effectively with each other and harmonize with one another because of the degree to which they interact in very crowded and large settings. So thinking carefully about how we can communicate across difference to kind of withhold judgment to the extent that we can is a goal that helps us to communicate better across different cultures and experiences. So one person that I think is a really good framework for understanding some of these issues better is Stuart Hall, who was widely considered to be the developer of cultural studies. Was a Jamaican theorist, scholar, researcher who was developing cultural studies as a way of understanding, defining, and differentiating cultures. So one thing we've talked about in this class is the difference between high and low context culture, right? High context referring to the use of a lot of nonverbal cues and symbols that can convey complexity of meaning, versus low context, you tend to say what you mean a lot more, right? Context and defining context is a contribution that Hall was able to bring to the table by helping us to understand and define cultures in different ways. I'm going to share us a clip from Hall, who I think does a great job of highlighting the importance of culture to develop a sense of shared meaning, including the ways that we can develop the use of language to communicate effectively with one another.
Sometimes culture is the way in which we make sense of or give meaning to things that one sort of another. It's true, of course, that we all don't make sense of things in the same way, and therefore that each of us has a little kind of conceptual word of our own, or rather we have our own sort of take on the conceptual word. But if we shared no concept together with other folks, we literally could not make sense of the world together. We could not build a social world together unless we were able to make sense of the world in world with people in the same way. Culture consists of the maps of meaning, the frameworks of intelligibility, the things which allow us to make sense of a world which exists but is ambiguous as to its meaning until we make sense. So meaning arises because of the shared conceptual maps which groups or members of a cultural society share together. And that's a very important kind of way of coming to an understanding of why in cultural studies, if you privilege the notion of representation as giving meaning, you're making culture a very central, you're giving it a kind of central role. It's not just sort of the values and things that we happen to have been born into. It literally is the way that without which we would find the world unintelligible.
So I really like the way that Hall characterizes this, right? That culture is not only about how we develop language, how we use language, how we draw from our own experiences, values, and so forth. Culture is a way by which we make the world intelligent. I like the kind of Venn diagram way of thinking about culture, that no single person is a culture, right? We might have cultures in us, or if you drink a lot of kombucha, you might have a lot of cultures in you. But cultures refer to, right, our interactions between people. That we develop culture through a sense of shared meaning, right, of the middle of the Venn diagram, and that we use language and shared understanding together, right? If you're part of a group and you have a set of norms, practices, things that you do together, that's a way that culture is built up, and that creates intelligibility. It creates our understanding of the world. What are the things that we believe that are important to us? For example, we believe in an afterlife or heaven. Well, that's going to significantly implicate the way that we look at this current world and the people on it. Do we believe in something like karma? What goes around comes around. Good things happen if we're good, bad things happen if we're doing bad things, right? That's a way of understanding and giving ourselves a way of making sense of the experiences that we have in our lives, right? So think about it like a pair of glasses, right? Our set of experiences, the ways that we think about various issues are shaped by culture, and that provides that psychological basis of understanding and communicating across difference. Pictured here on the right is Clifford Geertz, who is a prominent cultural historian, is widely known for the idea of fake description and the use of ethnography, right? Ethnography involves the ways in which a researcher or studier might go into a community and study or take field notes and participate as a part of that community or observe that community from the outside, right? So Geertz was very famous for a piece in which he was analyzing Balinese cockfighting, a cultural and historical practice that created a sense of shared meaning, right? We might not enjoy it. To some of us, that might seem vulgar, right? But to many people in Bali was seen as a significant practice of cultural expression. It has a lot of different rules. It has kind of a whole game. It has cultural significance behind it that helps us to understand how cultures might communicate differently. So Geertz's work was very much centered on understanding and defining culture, right? So both Hall and Geertz add a whole lot to how we can think about and understand a lot of fundamentals of culture. One of the key ideas that Hall brought forward, right, as we talked about, is the idea that cultures can be compared, not in terms of being better or worse, but in terms of having differences in the ways that cultures might communicate. Again, high versus low context culture, individualistic versus collectivist culture, the use of power distance, right? Higher power distance, meaning that you and members of another culture are less likely to express disagreement, you're more likely to submit to authority, versus low power distance, which you're more open to disagreeing with somebody who might have authority or power over you, right? Local perspectives help us to understand culture. How do we understand culture? By being there, right? By participating, listening, and engaging with people who are directly impacted or who we might study. There is a critique of scholars who are over in the ivory tower of academia and don't engage with the community, with the world that they attempt to study, right? A lot of my work is related to disability communication, researching and engaging with folks with disabilities. And there's a motto that many disability communities live by, which is nothing about us without us, right? The inclusion and engagement of the perspectives that you're attempting to study and engage with is really important, right? If you're a part of a group that is trying to do something like a diversity training, well, who is being represented in that training, right? Are you including diversity within the people and perspectives that are included in that training? That's important. One doesn't have to learn everything about a culture, right? Culture is multifaceted. We're never going to fully understand a culture that we're not a part of because we're not in it, right? But we can help to better engage, be sensitive and thoughtful to the needs of that culture and so on. We don't want to have a kind of defeatist, oh, I'm never going to understand all the intricacies, ins and outs of the culture, right? It becomes a kind of excuse for us not to learn anything. Instead, we should be learning the things about members of cultures and groups that allow us to engage effectively with those cultures and experiences respectfully. And to that end, right, cultures have very learnable rules. They have sets of things that we do as a part of a culture and things that we can recognize that we should do when we participate in that culture, right? So for example, I had a student in my last class who brought up a great example about how in her family, they cook rice. And typically when they are making rice together, the person who eats the last bite is the person that's responsible for cleaning up and cooking the next batch of rice, right? So if you were visiting that family and you ate the last spoonful, you would know, right? And that's a way to understand those rules. Experience counts, right? Being experienced, being involved, being an expert in or a member of a culture is a really important way that we build our understandings of cultural experiences. Differences in perspectives matter, right? A culture is not a monolith. In other words, a single member of the culture is not going to experience things in the exact same way as a different member of the culture. For one thing, we find ourselves members of multiple cultures. It might be our clubs and groups, it might be our beliefs, values, and so forth, right? But for another, our relationship to our culture can look really different. Perhaps culture, including a religious or spiritual perspective, is something that one is very detached from and really doesn't see as a core part of their identity. But for another person, it's crucial and it's a really important set of beliefs to them. So the perspectives that people have for the culture are very different. Now, international business, international relations, international trade are deeply connected to culture, right? Our ability to understand and engage across culture is crucial to understanding some of the most significant changes and trends in our lifetimes. For example, think about a lot of major summits, such as the G7 or G8, right, that involve world leaders needing to communicate and engage with people across different cultures. A lot of major agreements and treaties, including free trade agreements, such as NAFTA, the North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement, are very important ways that we've built a sense of community and relationships with other countries. We might also think about examples such as the United Nations, including the United Nations Security Council. I did Model UN in college. I thought it was a lot of fun to understand, kind of take on the role of a country and understand that different countries are coming in with very different perspectives, ways of communicating, and sets of concerns that they bring to the table. And as mentioned, culture is connecting to multiple disciplines, right? Culture is important and significant to communication, right? Critical cultural studies, for example, is a major subfield in communication. But culture also connects to, as mentioned, things like art, things like theater, humanities, English, writing, philosophy, anthropology, sociology, but even connects to some of the sciences in areas that you might not expect, such as business. Our ability to engage in workplace culture and understand the needs and how businesses create a sense of culture is important too. So we encounter a lot of challenges, right, as it pertains to becoming a member of and participating effectively in culture. One of the biggest challenges here is prejudice. Coming into an understanding of a culture with a negative opinion or judgment that guides the way that we behave or treat members of that group, right? We know that no one person of a culture or group is going to fully represent that cultural experience. Everybody is their own person, is impacted by culture, but is coming in from their own perspective. So we don't want to come in with a negative connotation to a person that lacks any sort of expectation or warrant. One way of thinking about this is, again, thinking about how things such as roles and values might be gendered, right? We associate at times certain behaviors, certain attire, clothing, activities, interests as masculine or feminine across different cultures. So we want to avoid, right, reaching a negative judgment about somebody for whom perhaps that expression and norms are different than we might expect, or we might not want to make an assumption about somebody's quality as human on the basis of their gender, right? A challenge, right, can be over focusing on a culture and ignoring an individual, right? So again, somebody is impacted by culture, but culture is not the whole stand of who they are as a person. For example, it would be incredibly offensive if you saw someone that you assumed was of Asian American or Pacific Islander descent, and without knowing anything else about that person, chose to bow at them, right? We would see that as incredibly inappropriate and insensitive because it would be making an assumption about their culture without focusing on the individual and their own experience or perspective. Stereotypes are resorted to if we lack context or information on the culture. That is, we gravitate toward things like media depictions, beliefs, assumptions that might be outdated, right? There's a concept in psychology known as contact theory. So contact theory states that if we have a personal relationship to somebody and we've developed a connection to somebody, that over time, we tend to hold less biased or prejudiced perspectives toward that population based on our encounters with that individual. Right, so our ability to have close connections to people that come from diverse perspectives and experiences is one way that we tend to reduce the stereotypes that we have about other people. We risk assuming similarity when cultural difference matters, right? We don't want to fall too far the other direction where we assume that everybody is the same and is looking at something like a meeting in the exact same way, when there might be different cultural impacts on how people are choosing to communicate. So when we think about culture in small group contexts, right, there's two ways this is happening. People are bringing cultures into small groups, and small groups themselves are creating culture via their participation and engagement with one another. That is, small groups develop culture because they have shared goals and a sense of purpose. Perhaps you're part of a study group, and over time, you meet every week, you're starting to develop close friendships with one another, right? You're becoming really close friends, and you start to develop a shared history with one another, right? Or perhaps you're a part of a club or activity that has had a long institutional history. Like there are trophies on the wall, there's like a photo of somebody, you have no idea who that was, but they were an alum. You start to have oral history shared, like stories of your experience and involvement with the team. That can be a way in which shared goals and purpose can be developed as part of a group. We also have, right, history. Again, the history of the group is a driving factor that shapes the traditions, the behavior of the group, and so forth. And small groups have norms, rules, and customs that are shaping behavior. Good example of this are many of the local and regional indigenous groups, including the Umatilla, Walla Walla, and Cayuse, the Confederated Tribes, right? Many of these tribes and groups do a number of events, including We've had some tribal leaders who have come to EOU campus, including coming to EOU to teach. And we've had a number of events, including events such as those in Pendleton, where every year Confederated tribes practice and share their beliefs and traditions. So thinking about small groups, there's a lot of different ways that these norms, these practices, and these behaviors are expressed. So understanding and making sense of these norms and how we behave and communicate within them is important. For a sillier example, last weekend, I was up in Portland and I decided as a bucket list item to take a spin class, and my legs still hurt. But there was a very strong community culture there, right? Where people were like kind of competing with one another. It was very silly. You might be part of another group, activity, club, and so forth, in which the things that you do in that meeting are shared among that group of people. It's how we are able to create culture through small groups, through actions, communication, and speaking, through working through shared goals together. So what I'd like you to do now is to think back to the group that you chose for your membership reflection. And when, in your own words, I want you to define what this group's culture is like. You might consider some of the unwritten rules, the norms, the values, the goals, things that are important as a part of this group. And then secondarily, how is this group's culture communicated? Take some time to think about how this culture is using communication to essentially share itself. So I'll give you a few minutes to work on this as your attendance activity for today. And then I'll ask us to go around and share some of the things that you came up with here. So I'll give you a couple more minutes, then I'll ask us to share. go ahead and wrap up your current thought or idea here. So I'm going to have us go around and when we get to you, share just a couple points here about how the group you chose has a culture and how it might communicate that culture. So let's start here on this side with Ben.
Oh, geez. Start right at it. So I did vending, I sold magic cards for years. So I put the call tends to focus on hard work and efficient communication and teamwork in order to maximize the amount of money you make in a weekend. And for the other one, you start by working in the store as an employee to build the basic skills needed. And after the basic skills are done, you do some trial runs at the booth where you're coached still.
Great.
And after that, you move into full employee or don't.
Yeah, the building of that kind of culture and experience and the group shaping the behavior they do later is a good example here of how culture and becoming like enculturated. Over here.
Yeah, so my group, we basically were just really results oriented. Because I chose a group project because it was, well, one of the better examples I had to choose from. And basically we just were really wanting to do really well because it was all of our majors and we wanted to do well. So we were really focused on results, basically. We were very task oriented on it.
Okay. Yeah. Good example here, the level of focus that a task-oriented group has.
I chose to talk about basketball group that I'm in here in high school. I started coaching our culture is pretty well and I would say it's really let anybody that wants to go and play and do really want to involve. I said some of our goals are just to have fun playing games that we like and try to ball.
Yeah, absolutely. Focus on kind of improvement in the context of the group is a good way that you can have those goals be developed. Okay.
So I chose this summer I worked as a river guide, and so that's a small group of people. And I just talked about like for the culture and stuff, it's like we definitely have like unwritten rules and norms. It's craft guides, like what you wear and how you talk about the river and stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very much shaped by like knowing how to do it,
Yeah.
right? Impacting your participation in membership. You got to come in with the right gear and right equipment to participate, for sure. Anyway.
So for my group, I will talk about my basketball team back in high school. So there are the obvious goals with building team chemistry and first week games and stuff with goal, but they also did have unwritten rules, which most teams, I assume, would implement, such as having your back always on. I mean, your team having your back in all.
Sure. Yeah.
So yeah, how the group communicates culturally, it's probably that even though that we were of different ethnic backgrounds, we still came together to play that one sport. So our genuine respect for each other for both as players and as people.
Great. Yeah. Talked a lot about synergizing and working well together, but also offsetting and supporting each other when there's somebody who needs that additional help.
So I chose my volleyball team, and like they said, there's like a lot of unspoken rules, like what time you show up to practice, or what you wear, or kind of like the things that we talk about at practice. I mean, also like focused on teamwork and like really focused on like the leaders being role models for other girls on the team and just like communicating well and being able to be open with each other and talk to each other.
Yeah. You're a part of a group, oftentimes it's very activity centric, right? There's a focus on making sure you're prepared to come in with the stuff that you need to get going.
My chosen group is my family. And also it's very oriented. There's not like a lot of small talks going on. I'll always people part of the achievement.
Good example here of how like the more family context, right? The goals and achievement norms might be particularly important thinking about the groups of that group working together.
I chose my high school softball team, the senior group. We have all been playing together since we were all married. We've been already else who, you know, you're on the team of freshmen, kind of unspoken, get there early, do well in school, and encourage you to do better.
So folks like Kelly are bringing out the ways that like norms are shaping our participation in groups by being a role model, right? We're expected to behave a certain way because we know there are going to be other people, including younger folks watching us, and we're setting an example for future cultural behavior.
I chose my Bible study group, and so for that culture, like, we all have like shared values and beliefs in like God and Christianity and things like that. So some sort of the norms in our group meetings, it's just like following along in your own Bible, and reading along, and just being kind and open to everyone.
Yeah.
Everybody's perspective on things, and then that's communicated, you know, via written rules, whether that's within the Bible itself, or just spoken rules about how we want meetings to run, things like that.
Yeah, so you have this kind of relationship between the things you're doing and studying, but there's also implicating the values and beliefs that you have within that group too. You have that relationship, because those two things play out. Second.
So I chose my varsity basketball team, and basically like everybody else said, one of the main goals we had is to like treat your team like a family, and to always trust each other and have each other's backs. That was super fun for us.
Similar kind of offsetting of trusting each other, supporting each other. What is in need of extra?
I chose my sophomore year roommates, and I just talked about how we all were we like valued our personal space and like time away from school, and we weren't like not at class or at soccer. So I'd say that we were very like individualist space, and we only have a lot of like group goals. Yeah, and we didn't really communicate very well, so they were like that to go off of.
Sure, a lot of us with roommates can speak to that, yeah. But having the ability to try to respect each other's personal space, recognizing that as an important value to the group.
Yeah, so I chose the baseball team, and
Mhm.
like a lot of sports, I feel like the culture is like competitive, when everybody just wanting to win.
Uh-huh.
But one of our norms is like you have to be able to take constructive criticism. Like obviously, like when we tell you how to better yourself, you don't want to, you know, take it the wrong way, but we're also trying to help you.
Yeah. Sometimes a culture of, break you down to build you up. There's going to be constructive criticism. Don't take it personally, and understanding how to take that information.
I chose my current roommate that I have, and she said, we have a lot of rules on our personal space, and we kind of all just respect that. So we all in our rooms, we really like just leave it there. But we also use like humor a lot, and we always see each other's videos, either our tags or other tags, because that's something collectively we all relate to.
And I went with my old Boy Scout troop for Casper, and mainly what our value for our learning skills for survival and helping others in the communities. As for communication wise, there's typically in form of either stories or traditions that happen. I mean, we have rules set, the rules that from the book. That were set in stone, but we also had our norms and the fun ones written, we're going to change that leadership shifted. Yeah, mainly just to fit how the troop would be running at the time.
That makes sense. Yeah, you change for context, for leadership, situation, and then it's amorphous. Yeah.
I think like ethnic group, kind of like generally narrative. And while there's a lot of diversity, regional, political, and religious, there are some general trends, and a lot of them are very individualistic, sort of value kind of being able to do what they want, say what they see about government interventions, social intervention. So it's kind of like a big culture, where the land of the free.
Sure.
Do a lot of things that maybe in other countries.
Yeah. Yeah. So thinking about how these kinds of beliefs and values are held among people for whom like ethnic, political, social similarities exist, I think is an important measurement as well to think about. So I really appreciated your input and perspective here, thinking about some of the ways that we engage in cultures, are members of different cultures, and how there's this relationship between what a culture does and how culture communicates that we can continue to think about. So we'll look at culture further next class. Please pass forward or email me your prompt for today if you haven't already done so. Have a great rest of your afternoon, and I will see you again for Wednesday's class.